Okay, so welcome. Today marks 100 years since a 310-mile long border was drawn, separating what we now know as Northern Ireland and the Republic. And since 1921, the question of unification in Ireland has been raised many, many times, but never quite as it is today. After years of turmoil following the Brexit vote from Belfast to Berlin, and in the context of EU membership, referendums on the Union across the UK, and a changing political landscape, the question of a united Ireland is once again on the table, but with a new and complicated twist. But that is not exactly the question we're asking tonight, and let me explain. My name is Ella Whelan. I'm a journalist writing for the Irish Times occasionally, and more frequently for the online magazine Spiked, The Critic, The Telegraph, and The Sunday Times. I've covered the issue of Ireland's role in and relationship to all discussions about Brexit on RTE, The Tonight Show, the BBC, Sky News, and elsewhere. I'm second generation Irish. My family is from the Wicklow Mountains in a village called Donard near Bortonlass, though I feel as though I can't remember what it looks like, but thanks to the pandemic, it's been a year and a half since I've been back, which is the longest in my lifetime. And no, my dad is not Gary Whelan off Ballycus Angel, although Ella, his daughter, did go to my primary school, and Avoca is only up the road. So small world, or coincidences, whatever you want to call it. When it comes to the question of Irish unification, I'm not objective or unbiased. Irish Border Poll, the website and campaign group hosting today's meeting, which is just a month old now, is interested in the reunification of Ireland. But perhaps more importantly, it aims to convince people in Britain why an Irish border poll is a democratic demand that people of every political persuasion and none should support. We're interested in bringing everyone, loyalists, unionists, Republicans, and those who don't have a dog in the race, those who've never thought about the question of Ireland before, into an open debate and discussion about an issue which I think has for too long been considered too sore, too delicate, and too contentious to broach. I know that I'm biased, but it's a great website with a lot of different kinds of opinion and different pieces and different columns on there, lots of information. So do take a look at irishborderpoll.com and subscribe to their newsletter and stay in touch. We've got about 1,000 followers at the moment we have, and we'd like to reach as many people as possible. Right, I'm eating up tonight's time. So before I introduce you to the people who will be taking us through tonight's discussion, let me just say a few quick things about Zoom. Now, some of you will be very familiar with Zoom and will be well used to it by now. Some of you, this will be the first meeting you've come to. So we will have an audience participation part of this where we'll be asking you for questions and comments to the speakers. And to get involved in that, when our chair gives you the cue, you either hit participants and hit the raise hand button, or you go to reactions and hit the raise hand button. Those are at the bottom of your screen there alongside the chat. You can ask questions in the chat, and I'll be manning that throughout the debate. But I would encourage you to be brave, stick your camera on, unmute yourself, and ask a question when you're called to do so, because it's much better if we do these things as much in person as possible, despite the fact that this is all online. Any technical queries, any technical questions that you have, I'm here in the background. You can ask a question on chat and message me directly. But we also have Harley Richardson, who is a friend of Irish Border Poll, and will be in the background if anyone has any technical issues. Just, again, stick them in the chat. Now, our speakers tonight have long biographies, very illustrious, which I encourage you to check out on their website, on our website, and check them out on Twitter and follow them. And they are both, very importantly, to be commended for what is somewhat unusual in being on opposite sides of the unification union divide when it comes to the question of Ireland, but having agreed very warmly to talk through their political differences and have a bit of a debate in tonight's discussion. And we really thank them for doing that. It's been really great to host this meeting. So they are Peter Cardwell, who hails from North Armagh. He's a Conservative and Unionist political commentator, a former special advisor to 2 secretaries of state for Northern Ireland, and the author of The Secret Lives of Special Advisors. And Colin Harvey is a professor of human rights law in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and is a fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Justice. He's also an associate fellow of the Institute of Irish Studies and is a member of the Management Board of Ireland's Future. So that's our 2 speakers. And I said, that Irish unification, good or bad, was not quite the question we were asking tonight. In fact, as you will know, that tonight's debate is Northern Ireland at 100. Is unionism emotionally ready for a conversation about a united Ireland? This is in part inspired by Peter Cardwell's piece for the Irish Times, in which he quite emphatically stated that it was not. The key tenet of unionism at its essence is complete inflexibility, he said. So him and Colin are going to discuss that. And that's really all from me now. I'm going to hand you over to the chair for tonight's discussion and the man who put this all together tonight. Kevin Rooney is a teacher in London and a co-author of Who is Afraid of the Easter Rising and the Bloodstained Poppy. He talks and writes regularly on education, politics, Irish current affairs, civil liberties and football. He's a passionate Celtic supporter and a shareholder of the club. And as founder of Irish Border Poll, it's likewise obvious where Kevin's own political views lie when it comes to the question of Irish unification. But have no fear, he is studiously fair and has chaired many, many debates for the organisation, the Academy of Ideas, Battle of Ideas Festival that I worked for over the years. And he's also keen for me to shut up and hand over to him. So without further ado, Kevin, I'll hand over to you now to begin tonight's discussion.
Ella, thanks for everything you said by way of introduction. I'm going to cut straight to the chase. So back in the middle of April, I read an Irish Times article by Peter Cardwell, and it sort of stopped me in my tracks. I thought it was an incredibly well-written article, though I didn't agree with chunks of it, but nonetheless, I thought it was a great article to debate and discuss further. So that's led to tonight's discussion. And I want to really thank Peter and Colin for agreeing to speak. And I want to first of all really thank Peter out loud, because I know that several people told him not to do the debate, advised him against debating tonight on the question of unification. So thank you, Peter, for stepping up to the plate and having the debate. And absolutely, Colin, thanks a million to you as well. I've never met either of you, but I've read quite a bit of both of you, so I'm really looking forward to it. The way it's going to work tonight is Peter will speak for about 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes max, and he's basically essentially going to elaborate on his Irish Times article, why I think you just aren't mostly ready for discussion and conversation about United Ireland. And when Peter's finished, we'll go straight to 5 minutes, maybe up to 7 minutes. And then after that, I might ask him a wee question or two. And then after that, I'll invite them to ask each other questions and debate and discuss. And where the little bit of excitement comes in, after that, it's over to you. You, the audience, can come in live with your questions and your comments. And we'll see how it goes. Hopefully your technology works better than mine, and we'll actually be able to hear you if you have any questions. So if you do have questions, I think Ella mentioned there's a wee box where you can signal with your hand if you want to get ready to ask a question. And of course, as Ella said, you can speak into the chat box as well. Okay, I hope that all made sense, but without further ado.
Well, listen, thank you very much indeed for to Kevin and to Ella and everybody at Irish Border Poll for inviting me to come along. I'm really looking forward to discussing tonight's issue with Professor Harvey and with others. And Kevin rang me and asked me to take part in this. It's true, a few people did say, you know, don't take part and so on, but actually I am very much of the opinion that it is absolutely possible to listen to many people's views without necessarily submitting to them, without necessarily agreeing with them, just as many people who've come along tonight will probably disagree with a lot of what I say, and that is absolutely fine, because debate and discussion is so much better than the alternative, which of course blighted our country for such a long time. The article I wrote for the Irish Times actually came out of a discussion with a friend of mine in Dublin, who until recently was a Fianna Fáil councillor, and we're really, really good mates. And actually he's mates with quite a few councillors from across the spectrum in Ireland. And I remember a couple of years ago, we went on holiday to the Middle East. And we had, the joke was, you know, a Fianna Fáil councillor, a Fine Gael councillor, an Irish Labour councillor, and a Tory special advisor walk into a bar in Jerusalem. So that was a slightly strange combination of people. But we were discussing the nature of unionism, and my friend was saying, you know, surely a federal Ireland would be fine, you know, if unionists had representation and participation in some sort of parliament or assembly at Stormont, if that was maybe one part of the governance Governments of Ireland. And I said, you know, this guy's a really intelligent guy, he's a barrister. And I said, you know, you just don't get it. The point of unionism is not, it's not inflexible in everything, but the key tenet of unionism is the union, the clues in the title. And whilst it's perfectly possible to talk about a united Ireland, there's absolutely no way that unionism will want to be part of any sort of united Ireland, because that is the nature of unionism. And the reality is that the people who will be asked about a united Ireland, there may well be a poll, of course, in fact, there probably should be, in my opinion, in the Republic of Ireland. But the key, nothing will happen without the people in Northern Ireland by a majority deciding that they want to be part of a united Ireland. And that is not the case at the moment. The desire isn't there. It may well be growing. There may well be statistics to suggest that. And of course, we've seen a lot of polling over the weekend as Northern Ireland's centenary is today. But what is the case is that unionism is in a really tricky position at the moment. It was actually Professor Harvey who said that the word timely is overused, but this will be a timely discussion this evening, and I agree with him in that. The article, I think what I'll probably do is actually just copy and paste it into the chat here if people want to kind of refer to it or have a quick look at it. Might be an easy thing. And I just very briefly just noticed that Finn said, will there be a recording? And I think there is a recording of this debate, so his family member can have a look at that maybe afterwards. But the article was really out of that discussion with my friend, and also thinking that for me, as David Trimble is my political hero and remains my political hero. And I think that unionism has very sadly gone in a direction that I'm not particularly happy with over the past number of years, and where he kept in leadership and were he to have continued as First Minister of Northern Ireland, I think things would have been a lot better. But of course, the circumstances weren't there. But he was asked a long time ago in 1988, actually, by Sean Farren, the SDLP politician. Dr. Sean Farren said, what does unionism really want? What is the desire that unionism has? And David Trimble quite simply said, to be left alone. And the idea, I think, for a lot of people who voted for the agreement, I was too young at the time, but my parents, for example, voted for it, some family friends and so on quite reluctantly, was that was the compromise, that was the end point. And I think for many in liberal unionism like me, that was how far the compromise was to be. The principle of consent obviously was a huge concession for nationalism and for republicanism, of course. But of course, nationalism and republicanism, from my perspective, and this may not be the perspective of people on this call, but from my perspective, they have used that as sort of a stepping stone to United Ireland, the first part in a process towards United Ireland. And it's interesting historically, if you look back, of course, many in nationalism in 1921 didn't think that partition would last a year or even a few years, and many in unionism even thought it would be for a generation. And of course, the greatest peril that that nationalism that partition was in was probably over the Second World War, or the emergency as it was known in the Republic, when Churchill, of course, offered to unite Ireland, where was De Valera to support the Allied efforts in the Second World War. So it's interesting people talk about Brexit as if it's kind of the first big threat to Northern Ireland's existence. It really isn't. Of course, Brexit has changed the dynamic, it's changed the narrative and the paradigm, and I think it's something, the protocol is something that so many unionists aren't happy with. And as I outline in the article, many unionists feel pretty much abandoned by Boris Johnson's government and feel abandoned by London. And that sense of Britishness, why are we loyal to a government that perhaps isn't loyal to us, is what some unionists say. I don't entirely agree with that, and I think the protocol can be made to work in some way. But certainly a lot of unionists see that, and it's very rare to get something that unites, a 13-year-old throwing a petrol bomb in West Belfast, and people sort of pottering around the archetypal garden centre unionist, if they feel the same way, a lot of them, about the protocol. And it takes quite a lot to unite them. Actually, a senior figure in the DUP said that to me recently, and when that happens, you really do need to worry. But of course, what happened, the agreement, to me, the majority of the last 23 years, until Brexit really, has been about making the border not irrelevant, but certainly invisible. And the only thing I noticed, I don't know about other people, but the only thing I really noticed was going across on the train or in the car was, your mobile phone. beeps to tell you you're in Vodafone Ireland or whatever it is. So I think it's interesting that now, because of Brexit, we're thinking about the border a lot more. We're thinking about our nationality a lot more, whether that's British or Irish or Northern Irish. And we're thinking about Europeanness a lot more as well. And I think that is not necessarily a bad thing to think about, but the danger then comes for me as a unionist when that then leads to thoughts and talk of a united Ireland. And Jim O'Callaghan, who very thoughtful, interesting guy who may well be the next leader of Fianna Fáil, outlined a lot of this in a seminar he gave to City Sussex College, Cambridge, which I took part in, when he said, you know, we need to start preparing for United Ireland now. And I, as a unionist, was quite spooked by that. I think a lot of people feel that there cannot be simply this inevitability of a united Ireland, that this is the only thing that there will be. Why not have a conversation about the next 100 years of the United Kingdom? Why not talk about, it's not something I would want, but why not talk about an independent Northern Ireland? Why not talk about a federal Ireland with states that are perhaps part of a wider union, but not a united Ireland? So I think there's a lot of conversation going on at the moment. There's a lot of discussion that hasn't previously been had, but this unionism is in a really tricky stage at the moment, and I'm sure there will be people on the call who will be quite happy about that. But if you think about it, you've got many aspects of unionism that are really in jeopardy. You've got a very divided and weak leadership of unionism. Of course, there'll be a new DUP leader and First Minister, not necessarily the same person, soon. And Arlene Foster, it comes to quite a lot when Arlene Foster is seen as someone who's too liberal and for abstaining on a vote on gay conversion therapy. So it's a really interesting time for unionism, especially in the sense of, in terms of the emotional aspect of things and how they're thinking about Northern Ireland as a country, especially as we celebrate or commiserate, depending on your viewpoint, that it is 100 years since partition. So I think for a long time, a united Ireland, for me anyway, was not a lot of meat on the bone. There was a lot of talk, especially from Sinn Féin, on terms of what a new Ireland, a socialist Ireland, would look like. But when you have very serious people like Jim O'Callaghan talking about this, and of course the Claire Byrne Live programme and people like Andrew Trimble, and I made the point in the article that Andrew Trimble, rather than David Trimble, is really the mainstream of many unionist people now who feel perhaps Northern Irish, who feel perhaps a bit Irish. The British identity is diluted, but the fact is that those who feel British, who are unionist, are still the majority, it would appear, although Colin Harvey may disagree with me on that. And were you to have an Irish border poll tomorrow, the likelihood is that it would be defeated by many people who are not necessarily Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist community people, but also people who may not feel, who may be Catholic nationalists, who may not feel that they want to be part of a United Kingdom, United Ireland just at this exact moment, and that more discussion needs to be had around there. So this is a really interesting debate, and I don't feel I'm betraying my unionist principles by taking part in it. I'm sure that many others will have many interesting points to make. And it's really interesting that there are going to be a huge number of viewpoints on the people who are on this call, and I see a few familiar names as well. Some people I know, and some people I just know because I've seen them on the media and so on. And there's at least one person on the call who said that the title of this discussion was something which they found patronising as a title, and I had to sort of slightly sheepishly point out that actually it was based on the headline of the article I'd written for the Irish Times. So really looking forward to hearing what Colin and others have to say. So I'll stop talking now, and we can have a great discussion this evening.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, Ella, and thank you in particular, Peter, for the opportunity this evening to discuss with you and with everyone. I just want to reiterate the sense that, Peter, people who may not have wanted Peter to engage in this discussion tonight, and perhaps there are people who may have not wanted Peter to engage with me tonight. So I'm really, really delighted, Peter, that you have decided to be with me tonight and be with us for this conversation. So you're very welcome, and it's a great opportunity for a discussion.
Thanks,
Peter.
Colin.
Thank you, Peter. Peter's article made me think very deeply, and like Kevin, give me a chance to discuss further this evening. I suppose a number of concerns and points just want to raise tonight. I suppose the starting point is that it's been challenging and difficult to get the legitimacy of this debate even accepted. As you'll know, Peter, and as many people will know, all around the world, people stand up and praise the Good Friday Agreement. Everyone loves the Good Friday Agreement. But occasionally I wonder, has everyone actually read the text of the Good Friday Agreement? Because what we're talking about tonight is a core constitutional component of that agreement. So I really want to start by underlining the legitimacy of the conversation that we're having. The constitutional status of this region rests on consent, and the mechanisms around testing the principal consent and the right to self-determination are there, and they're at the core of the agreement. Also, really to underline this evening that those who are advocating change are coming from a space of what I think is care, concern, a duty of care, and almost due diligence. Why do I say that? Well, those who are advocating constitutional change, those who are advocating a new Ireland, if you like, the architects who are designing a new home, and they want that home to be a welcoming, shared home place for absolutely everyone on this island. So in doing that, there's really a warm invitation of welcome to everyone who wants to participate in that conversation, because nobody involved in advocating for change wants to design a new home without the input of a significant number of people who share the island that we're on. And I think the motivation for the discussion comes out of a deep and profound sense of care and concern not to repeat the mistakes of the last 100 years. In this design process that we're all engaged in, we want to get it right, and we want people to join us in that conversation. And just again tonight, extend a warm welcome to everyone willing to participate and engage. Ultimately, I think, however, it is up to change advocates. If you're advocating change on this island, then it's up to you to build and make a persuasive case. You have to articulate to people what a new Ireland looks like, what a united Ireland looks like. It's not enough to continue to come up with rhetorical platitudes about the future. There needs to be detail and there needs to be substance. And the only people who can do that are people who are advocating change. You know, a question I would ask to all those arguing for a new Ireland is that when you turn up on the doorsteps of people during these referendum campaigns, what are you going to say? What is going to be in your literature? And if you can't answer that question, you need to start doing the work now to articulate what is your argument going to be when these referendums happen. Just to agree with Peter about political unionism in particular. The clue to unionism, as Peter has said, is in the title. And I think mutual respect requires us to acknowledge that political unionism, by and large, will be working on making the case for the union. You know, in a sense, change advocates can't expect political unionism to design a united Ireland, although there'll be a warm welcome for all those who are engaging in the discussion. And it's particularly noticeable, for example, voices from civic unionism engaging in that conversation. But by and large, I think, and obviously enough, you know, unionism and political unionism will be working on building the case to maintain the union. Change advocates should be working on building the case for change. And that seems to me an entirely logical set of propositions. Worries at the moment, however, and there are many worries, and we've heard some of the concerns from unionism this evening, but from change advocates, and you will have seen this over the weekend, there is a growing anxiety and worry that 1998, and people forget this, was a constitutional compromise. What happened in 1998 is not a settlement and never was a settlement. It rests the constitutional status of the North on the principle of consent, and there's a clear right to self-determination in that agreement as well. So ultimately, it's not for politicians or for institutions. It's not for Micheál Martin or Boris Johnson. It's for the people on the island of Ireland to determine their own future. And I think that's important. Why? Because what we've seen over recent times is a steady chipping away and undermining of some of the basics in the Good Friday Agreement. We've had ideas mooted that would essentially take us back to the drawing board in relation to that agreement. And tonight, let me say, I think that is very, very risky territory. If we start undermining, rewriting, or walking away from the core textual promises in the Good Friday Agreement, I think we're heading into very, very worrying territory. Now, I don't need to reiterate all the points about how widely endorsed the agreement is. People know that. But some of the things being mooted, undermining 50+1, for example, are deeply concerning. But ultimately, I want to end on a positive note. And again, just say to Peter how pleased I am that we're having the discussion tonight, because I've been really impressed by the depth and scale of the discussion and the work that has already started. Yeah. I think the discussions have already started. I was doing a list today of all the various civic initiatives from political parties and their members, the university projects that are all ongoing at the moment across these islands and beyond, the work that governments are doing, for example, the work that's been done in the Shared Island Unit, the work that legislatures are doing, for example, recently gave evidence to the Oireachtas Joint Committee on the Good Friday Agreement, and actually last week, the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee for the Executive Office on this precise point. So it's really, really very heartening to see the depth and scale of the work that's ongoing. I want to underline tonight that everyone is warmly invited to that discussion and delighted to be here this evening, but also mutual respect requires that political unionism, and many unionists quite rightly will prefer to be getting on with the work of building the case for maintaining the union. It's up to change advocates to make the case for what a new Ireland looks like, and that work has started. So ultimately then to end, why am I doing this with others? Because in my view, this island is on a trajectory. It's on a pathway to the concurrent referendums referenced in the Good Friday Agreement happening in the decade ahead. And I do this work because I feel an enormous sense of personal responsibility to join with others to do the work in advance, to not stumble into referendums on this island unprepared, so that people, when they go to vote in these referendums, north and south, on the same day, I hope, in my view, will know what exactly they are voting for, what exactly they are voting against. To me, it's a responsible thing to do. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Colin, thank you very, very much. I think I've got about 3 questions, maximum, possibly only 2, for Peter and Colin. But before I do that, I want to say 2 quick things. I forgot to thank 2 people, and I want to say this in case I forget. The first one is Hardy, who's in the background, which a lot of people will be unaware of, who's pulling levers and pressing buttons. And the second person is a colleague of yours, Colin, at Ireland's Future. I really want to thank Jerry Carlisle for all the help and advice he gave me in getting Ireland, getting Irish Border Poll up and running. So Jerry, if you're listening, thank you very much. And if you're not listening and someone knows him, pass on my thanks to Jerry. Now, Peter and Colin, you come across as 2 really good, warm-hearted, decent people. And when we're warm-hearted, decent friends, we're allowed to do a bit of straight talking. So here's my first question. It's about the Good Friday Agreement. Peter, you said that the Good Friday Agreement was effectively an endpoint. It was a settlement. Colin, you're saying that it's a process actively, and in a way, United Irelanders might see it as a route map. Colin, can we speak for another few seconds, half a minute or a minute each on this? Let's start with yourself, Peter. Do you stand by the position that you see the Good Friday Agreement as done and dusted endpoint, and that almost the United Islanders are cheating in the way that they're using the Good Friday process to promote a united Ireland at the moment?
Well, I think it's perfectly legitimate, of course, to push for a united Ireland. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to push for, as long as it's done through exclusively peaceful and democratic means. I think that's something we can all agree on. It's obviously not something I want to happen. And I actually agree with Colin on the 50+1 undermining aspect. And I think it should be, some people suggesting in recent days that there should be a 2/3 majority in a referendum. I don't believe that should be the case, even though I obviously don't want it to happen, because I think that that is a fundamental principle of the Belfast Agreement. In terms of, I mean, it has been tinkered with, of course, already, in terms of the St Andrews Agreement, in terms of Fresh Start, in terms of the Stormont House Agreement, and various other successors, I suppose, to the Belfast Agreement. But when we're talking about it, I suppose that's what we think in that regard. I mean, in terms of it being a compromise, it's interesting. Ken McGuinness said back in the day, I mean, David Kerr, I think, was on BBC One Northern Ireland recently saying this. David Kerr, who was a press officer and kind of senior advisor to David Trimble, was there saying, was on television saying that Ken McGuinness said, look, been through a lot of these negotiations. Every time we continue to negotiate, we're offered something worse for unionism, and this is the time to compromise. This is the time to essentially stop, I suppose. And obviously there are many things within the Belfast Agreement that I personally wouldn't be happy with, for example, prisoner releases, but obviously the concessions in terms of Articles 2 and 3 and so on was very important, although I believe that decommissioning should have been honoured much sooner than it was. But I suppose the point is that the consent principle is there. That was a huge shift, of course, for nationalism. And that is, of course, what Colin is talking about, and saying that there should be a referendum. I don't feel the statistics are there at the moment. They may well be at some stage, and it's a decision for Brandon Lewis, the Secretary of State, or whoever is the Secretary of State at the time, to see if there is evidence there to suggest that a border pool should be there. But I just as a final point, I think what Colin was saying in terms of people who want a united Ireland should prepare, I wholeheartedly believe that unionism should be advocating the union to a much greater extent. And the problem with this emotional state that it's in at the moment is that it's a defensive one. And this is kind of the point in Scotland as well. And maybe we'll talk about Scotland at some point in this discussion. But the point, I suppose, is that it's a very defensive kind of brace yourself kind of mentality, and unionism needs to be much more confident. It needs to sell the benefits of the union. It needs to say it is much better, for example, to be part of the world's fifth largest economy than a much smaller economy. We didn't hear a lot during the Brexit debate in terms of the huge amount of trade that Northern Ireland does with Great Britain, which is its biggest trading partner, much bigger than any other European country, including Ireland. So there are many ways in which I think the union can be advocated for that it hasn't been already. And this is something I think unionism needs to regain its confidence and stop being so defensive. And I think if nationalism is going to be positive, and of course many things about nationalism are very positive, and I remember as a reporter for the Belfast Telegraph many years ago, having my first experience of covering Gaelic football and seeing just how incredibly emotionally attached and rightly so that many people are to Gaelic football, something that was totally outside my realm of experience. And I covered the Armagh Tyrone final, which was just totally different for me. And I realized that there are so many bits of nationalism that are so positive and unite people within that community. Unionism needs to be less defensive, needs to be more aggressive in a peaceful way, and realize that there is a very strong case to be made for the union. It needs to make that case. And actually, whilst I don't want one, a border pool would force unionists to think, actually, what is the benefit of the union, and how can we sell this to people, and how can we say, as someone was saying on the chat there, how can you be someone who is pro-union without necessarily being a unionist and being, for example, a DUP voter, which I am not.
Yep. Brilliant. But Peter, I'm going to push you because we're all friends. I just want to really push you on this. I'm sorry if I'm panicking.
No, go ahead.
It's about the Good Friday Agreement, because when I was reading something that you had written, and I think you said it at some other point where we were having the conversation before this discussion, you said that the Good Friday Agreement is seen by unions as the end point, as the settlement. Yeah. Can I be clear from you? You're happy, you have no problem, you accept the legitimacy of United Irelanders like Colin, who are using the Good Friday Agreement to argue forward towards the potential and possibility of United Ireland? Question
Yes,
mark.
absolutely. I would never stop anybody advocating for anything that they feel is reasonable constitutionally, as long as it's done by exclusively peaceful democratic means. My point, I suppose, is simply that yes, unionism and sort of Trimbleites like me would sort of say that should have been the end point, essentially. But of course it wasn't, and it was never going to be for nationalism. But I think maybe that was a naive belief by unionists, that simply this would be, the assembly would be up and running. And I suppose that's the greater question, certainly in regard to Sinn Féin, in terms of, is it within Sinn Féin's interest? And this is not a question for me, this is a question for me, for nationalists and Republicans, but is it within Sinn Féin's interest to make Northern Ireland work, for there to be a functioning government at Stormont? Or is it better that there isn't, because then it looks as if a United Ireland would be a better solution? So I suppose that's the question for nationalism. But no, I totally, people can advocate what they want to advocate. I think what unionism didn't realize is that it was, this argument is never going to be over, essentially, and people are not going to simply not believe what they believe. But I think the principle of consent is probably the greatest safeguard against United Ireland that there ever has been, or probably will be, because you couldn't have another, Churchill saying to De Valera, we're going to just give you unilaterally Northern Ireland, because the people in Northern Ireland themselves will be the ones who will decide. And of course, there may well be a concurrent referendum in Ireland, but unless the people of Northern Ireland agree to United Ireland, it won't happen. And that, to me, is the greatest safeguard. And that, to me, means that there will be a United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, for many years to come.
Brilliant. Colin, let me push you a little bit. Let me be tough on you, if you don't mind, Colin. So I take your point entirely when you say it's about establishing the legitimacy. It's about normalizing the conversation around United Ireland. It was almost seen as you weren't allowed to have that debate. So 100% I'm with you. But here's my question. Is it the case that the worst thing that could happen is that the Secretary of State for the North of Ireland calls a border poll in 18 months? Because the bottom line is that United Irelanders do not have any meat on the bone to offer unionists at the moment. If you take, for example, what type of national health service would exist in an All Ireland or New Ireland, etc. In other words, there's no offer, that the United Irelanders aren't in the position to even make an offer yet. So the idea of a border poll is going to effectively be quite a lot of years down the line. And if you've been really, really honest, and you might not agree with this, Colin, that actually United Irelanders would not want a border poll in the near future, question mark.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Starting point for responding to your question is to look at the language that people are using in the debate. The language that is being used in the debate is about responsible planning and preparation for change in advance.
Yes.
Yeah. In other words, doing the homework now. I also wrote a piece for the Irish Times recently as well, and that was the premise for the piece. The work needs to be done in advance, and there's still work to do on that. I have asked very, very hard questions of those advocating for a new Ireland and for constitutional change. It has to be very, very clear what the proposition is in advance of that happening. Also, look, to respond to Peter, I do not think a united Ireland is inevitable. I think no political project is essentially inevitable. It requires hard work to persuade people and to make the case. But what is absolutely clear is that the Good Friday Agreement underpins the legitimacy of this discussion. No one should have any fear about joining this debate on whatever side they're on if they're a supporter of the Good Friday Agreement, of which many people claim to be, because it's absolutely there. And I do detect there is a bit of a climate of fear still around participating in this, and I don't think people should feel that way. But let me also add this point. Look, let's be clear. This region was removed from the European Union against its will, essentially. A majority of people here voted to remain in the European Union. If we weren't having this conversation in the sort of focused way that we're having it now, it would be utterly bizarre and very, very odd. I think what has happened over recent years is that the nature of the conversation has changed rather dramatically. Let me just give you an example. I have a problem being described as a nationalist. I don't see myself as a small n nationalist in any way. I spent my entire life and career working for equality, human rights, and social justice for everyone on this island and beyond this island. So I don't see anything that I do as in any way connected to narrow nationalism in any sense. I'm very much interested in this debate because it's about improving the lives of everyone who shares this island, north and south, and will be better off at the end of it. So ultimately, you know, part of the reason for being engaged in this discussion is that rather than retreat and withdrawal from the wider world, many people who are involved in arguing for constitutional change want to be part of a wider pluralist, transnational, global, and European project. They see what's happening in the Brexit conversation in rather anxious terms. They see a UK that's withdrawing from the world and becoming increasingly inward looking and don't want any part of that. But just to really end where I started, I don't think that a united Ireland is inevitable, but that's the outcome I would like to see. I think the work needs to be done in advance. Much of that work has already started. I would challenge advocates of this discussion to do even more work. I think we're moving into a phase now, however, you know, just to underline again, mentioned Ireland's future, mentioned the university initiatives, mentioned what work political parties are doing that are arguing for change. I think we're probably moving into a phase now where there needs to be coordination, you know, to be clear about what exactly the proposition is, because there's so many initiatives now scattered all over the place. At some point, that's all going to have to be brought together. Why? Because I think ultimately Peter and I probably in a number of years' time, I think within this decade, are perhaps going to be on opposite sides of a referendum campaign. And whether you're an advocate of the union or whether you're an advocate of a new Ireland, you need to be crystal clear what the offer is to people. I do not agree with those who say that we have an in principle referendum on the principle in the abstract, and then we do the work afterwards. I think that would be a profound mistake. I think we have to do the work first. We have to work through the hard and difficult questions. And let's be clear, this will be a major and fundamental challenge to the Irish state. This will be a challenge to the Irish government. This will challenge core elements of the way the South is constructed at the moment. But I think deferring that conversation is not helpful to anyone. So yes, continue the preparations. Just a final point is this. There's a debate about dates and timeframes. Look, who listening to this call tonight thinks that any sensible planning project on this island or these islands would ever get done if we continue to engage in abstract, protracted waffle for the next 100 years? We need to get serious. And the only way to do that, I think, for any planning project is to have some sense of a time frame and a deadline. How much homework would get done in these islands if there were no deadline for any of that homework? So while I see the point about a date, I do think it's very, very helpful to have a time frame. Why do I think that? Because that's the way to get the work done. Otherwise, people will be talking in theoretical and abstract terms for the next 100 years. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm going to go out to questions after this last question, and I'm going to take, I see Manley, Connor, Brian, and Simon. So we'll take those 4 questions in a batch and come back to both of you, and you pick up what you will from those questions. But really quick question to both of you. Peter, it relates to your Irish Times article, and it was the point which was the crux of your article where you said that the essence of unionism is its inflexibility. And I wanted to ask a question because I was listening to Ireland's Future a couple of months ago, and Andrea Catherwood was cheering for people from a Protestant sort of civic unionist background. And what was really striking was their flexibility and their openness. And last night, I'm really sorry, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was from the Museum of Free Dairy, and the podcast was Perspectives on Partition, I think it was called. And he was interviewing Susan McKay, and Susan McKay has got her new book out, coming out. I think it's called Shifting Ground, and it's a series of interviews with Protestants and unionists. And what was striking, listening to Susan McKay, was she was making the point that the Protestants and unionists she was speaking to are generally really pragmatic and much more open than people think. So I just want to think out loud to both of you. Where is unionism at? Is it really where you're saying it's at, Peter? What percentage roughly do you think are inflexible? Or what? Am I getting that wrong from Susan McKay and the Ireland's Future debate that I was listening to with those unionists? And then we're out for questions.
Sorry, Kevin, I just lost you at the end there, but I'll certainly pick up on what I think you were asking there. Yeah, there's political unionism, and then there's sort of civic unionism and just ordinary people who happen to be members of the unionist population. It's not a monolithic block. But I think in my article, I suppose I was writing mostly about political unionism, but on people who really genuinely are very, very strong on the constitutional issue and see it as part of their essence and are not relaxed about it, essentially. I've never been someone who feels I have to put a union flag on my house, for example. I don't ever feel that I need to flash around my British passport in the airport or anything like that to, prove that I'm a Protestant, prove that I'm a British citizen. I'm very relaxed in my Britishness and in my unionism, and I think that is something that so many people aren't. But certainly there are many, many shades of opinion. I think political unionism may be about to take a backward step, certainly in regard to the leadership of the DUP. I feel that there could be a situation where unionism is much more entrenched and becomes a very anti-protocol, anti-Irish government, anti-Sinn Féin force. Of course, it's always been anti-Sinn Féin, but I mean anti kind of working with Sinn Féin within Stormont. I don't think it's out of the realms of possibility that Stormont collapses before an assembly election. But that's political unionism, and there are many, many people who don't wake up in the morning and are unionists or pro-union, but their first thought is not, as David Irvine once said, I wake up in the morning, I don't want to think am I British or Irish, I want to think am I going to be late for work. And it is that kind of idea of really that unionism and your nationality and your idea of the constitutional settlement is part of your identity, but it's not your whole identity. And I think there are many people who feel that way and who may hypothetically be persuaded about a united Ireland. There were a couple of people saying in the comments there, well, unionism is so entrenched because it doesn't matter about what the person was saying, corruption or perceived corruption in the UK government, or KNP O'Donoghue or O'Donnell or something. I couldn't see the whole end of the name. It would make absolutely no difference. Unionism is because of culture, tradition. Surely you have to look at circumstances and think what is the best for all the people who live on the island. And I would say, that is very similar. I would make exactly the same argument in terms of nationalism. I would make exactly the same argument and say that there is a large block of people in the middle whose the constitutional position is not their number one concern, and they want what's best for their kids. They want what's best for their pension, for their salary, and all the rest of it. And I think actually Colin and others will have a bit of work to do in terms of persuading many people that a united Ireland is the best way in terms of something like the NHS, for example, but also because of how many people work for the civil service and work in administration for the civil service, and would that structure all exist in terms of where if there is a united Ireland, would people have those jobs? Where would those jobs go? Would there be a need for some sort of economic bailout from what was then used to be the UK, etc.? So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of any practicality, and I think that's often where the argument falls down. Is I noticed someone saying the UK has the lowest pensions of any developed country, but we also have a lot of other benefits for pensioners, including free travel, free TV license, And you have, of course, very secure jobs for people within the public sector, which is not always the case in every developed country. So there are pluses and minuses, but I think the pluses of the United Kingdom are a lot stronger now than they would be.
Peter, that's brilliant. And you straight on to a separate question there as well, which people can pick up in the questions and answers if they want, which was really, when you're looking at the question of for the union or for Irish unity, is it a head or a heart thing? Are you going to heart or your head, question mark? Colin, Janet, do you have a brief comment on that? And then I'll get out to the audience.
My comment on that is that the constitutional change conversation is very much with the head. And all the evidence that I've seen, and we're seeing more and more of that, evidence and research coming online. I was recently looking at some work that John Doyle, Seamus McGuinness and others are doing around the economic case. Just to be very, very concise, we would be better off in a new Ireland. It seems to me that the evidence emerging around that, there's more work to do. There's some unknowns, but as was said in the Irish Times article, I think today, some of the economic debates around this against it are red herrings.
Yeah,
they're scare stories. Part of the reason why I think the change case is so persuasive is increasingly clear to me that people in the North will be better off in a new Ireland within the European Union.
Brilliant, Colin. Now here we go. Fingers crossed the technology works. That was brilliant. Thanks to both of you. I'll take what I'm thinking is, if I take 4 people, and Colin and Peter, you can pick up what you want without spending too long on it. And then I'll go out and get another round of questions, and we'll wrap up, roughly speaking, about 8:15. And look, last thing from me, I think most people listening and viewing are from what you might broadly call the United Islander background. But I know that I personally know some unionists and loyalists who are listening in and viewing. So don't be shy. If you've got something to say, something you want to ask Colin or Peter, please stick your hand up and get stuck in. So Manley, are you there and can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. First of all, Kevin, so I'll keep it very brief. So very good to be in a conversation with unionism. First of all, a conversation is the first point. We're from a certain nationalist background, but I fully respect the unionist points. What I would say to you is one thing really, is that I feel personally that United Ireland is a progressive thing, but I also think that within the EU situation, it's a colony. So do we want to really give up a certain position which our people fought and died for, to be in the EU colony? Or in fact, is it more progressive to open up unionism and join the UK outside of the EU? Is my one question.
I think that's a very good question. So thank you for that. And Connor, can you hear me?
Hi Peter, how's it going? You're looking well. No, look, I suppose I'm interested in this discussion. I've 2 10-year-olds in the house, so in 20 years' time they'll be 30 years of age, and I'm from a financial background, and I'm really fascinated by the economics of Northern Ireland. So I suppose in the last couple of years I've tried to understand the financial side to how we actually pay for things in Northern Ireland. And I think that what's not talked about, and Colin made this point, is the economic side of this discussion. Now it's starting to get out there, but we do need more people talking about the financial aspects of how do we pay for things. And I think one of the big challenges that we have in Northern Ireland, I have a shopping list today of about £20 billion. And recently I took part in a debate with Graham Goodgin, who was a former economic advisor for David Trimble. And his position on this is to just ask the British government for more money. Pretty much that's what his position was whenever we had this discussion. Now, Peter has a really interesting background and perspective in this, because you really have an inside track on what happens in Westminster. And we've had 4 or 5 secretaries of state here who have basically keep telling us that there is no more money. And that is starting to antagonize people like me who understand the financial aspects of this conversation. And what I'm really trying to figure out then, Nelson McCausland said on the Nolan show about 2016, Brexit at any cost, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what his point of view was. So I suppose, Peter, the question that I wanted to know from your perspective, because I really admire your perspective, but I'm really interested in your answer to this. But is it a case that it's unionism at any cost? Because what I'm encouraged by is the economic argument is going to get out into the public domain over the next 18 months because more and more people are becoming interested in this, right? And, you know, I think it's going to be much easier to make the argument for the economic argument for a new Ireland than the economic argument for unionism. The concern I have for unionism is I'm not seeing anybody making this economic argument for unionism. My observation would be there isn't one. And that's something that I'm really interested to hear your view on. You know, back to my question then is it unionism at any cost? Because the title of this discussion is unionism emotionally ready for a conversation about the United Ireland?
Thanks,
Is
Colin.
that fair? Do you know where I'm getting from?
I do, 100%. And Brian, you're next, and then we're going to go Simon, and then we'll go back to our two speakers, and we've got a lot of people with their hands up, so we'll see how we can get on with how many we can take in. So Brian, are you there?
Hi, yeah, Kevin, thank you. And just thanks to Colin, obviously, and Peter. I think my question is posed to Peter primarily, and Peter, most refreshing and very pleasing to hear your contribution tonight. What I'd like to ask, based on what Colin and others are saying in terms of making the case for a new Ireland in every sense, politically, economically, every way, what I thought I would ask you was, have you thought about, as in the next few years, as we may go forward in terms of a border poll at some time and the various cases are made, have you thought about what unionism can do to make nationalists feel more comfortable in Northern Ireland, in the state of Northern Ireland, in terms of, yes, how would you convince them that Northern Ireland can be as much a home for them within the United Kingdom as it can be for unionism within the United Kingdom? And therefore, what would you do? What would be the main things you would do to make nationalists feel more welcome and comfortable, and therefore potentially vote to stay in the UK in the event of a border poll?
Thanks very much for that.
My question is basically from someone living in Britain. You know, we used to argue that the British working class in particular had an interest in United Ireland. I wonder if the rest of Britain have an interest either way of a United Ireland, or to keep the North as it is.
Brilliant. Sometimes the best questions are short and sweet. I love it. And we're going to go back, and Colin and Peter, it's harsh of me to demand this, but do you mind if I ask you to be fairly brief, not to pick up everything and just go for the ones you want to come back on? And why don't we go with you first, Colin, and we'll take Peter second this time.
Okay, there's a lot there. I'll just, in the interest of being as concise and brief as possible, take
I know it's a tough gig.
On Manley's point, look, I myself have been critical of the European Union from a human rights and equality perspective over a number of years, but the European Union is not a colonial situation. And I simply think my view is that we would be much better on this island if we were all under a pluralist European Union roof. And that's my view on that. And we'd be better off in the longer term. But mainly also because I think it changes the dynamics of the conversation wherever you sit on that. You know, the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement are now an automatic way back to the European Union. And it strikes me as really quite odd that that's so rarely mentioned in some of the media debates around this, around the protocol, that basic fact is often omitted. At Connor's point, you know, I'm not an economist, but the current arrangements here don't work for people in Northern Ireland. The appalling levels of economic performance here and deprivation, the current situation is not working economically. And I think part of the argument for change is essentially an argument, wherever you stand on constitutional questions, that we'll be better off. Across a whole suite of areas, people here will simply be better off in new arrangements. And one of the interesting things that's been happening in recent months and years has effectively been myth-busting the sort of misinformation that's there about what a new Ireland will be, just about living conditions north and south, you know, just tackling myths that are there, challenging those myths. But let me be absolutely clear, economically, a sense that, you know, we could unleash the potential of this island economically if we were, in a sense, integrated entity within the European Union. Our potential is not being realized at the moment. Brian's point about one of the things that really concerns me is obviously there's a major emphasis. If you're advocating for change, right, there's an onus on you to make your case for change. So if you're advocating a new Ireland, you better be clear about what that's about. But I think sometimes that lets unionism off the hook. You know, what's the unionist proposition in terms of maintaining the current union? And I think complacency there's no room for it. What I've said is this, and this is going to sound maybe naive to a lot of people at the moment in terms of what we're seeing in this debate. Let me be absolutely clear. And thinking about the day we're in today, we've had 100 years of avoidance on this island, 100 years of avoiding each other, of avoiding the hard questions, and that needs to be brought to an end. The Good Friday Agreement is structured around the concept of peaceful and democratic persuasion, of people making their case and building their case, that the only force that matters today on this island is the force of the better argument. So make your case and try and persuade me either way. That should be what we're thinking about. And Simon's point in terms of people in England, Wales, Scotland, look, let's be absolutely clear this evening. The current arrangements across these islands aren't working. They're not working for anyone. And that's why people like me are involved in conversations around change, because it's not working and we can do much, much better than we're doing now. Thank you.
Alan, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Peter, I'm asking you the impossible question. Can you be as quick as you can, though, Peter? But at the same time, you know, feel free to really pick up what you want.
I will try. What Colin's saying, you know, what will a new Ireland be? What will it look like economically? The answer is we don't know, and we can't know because it's a hypothetical, and also we don't know what United Ireland would look like, whether it would be a federal idea, whether it would be, you know, what would the civil service look like, for example. So there are a lot of what ifs, and I think I could probably agree with Colin in that sort of hammering out that detail is something that nationalism and the United Ireland argument should probably do. Connor Devine, thank you very much for saying I'm looking well. I'd probably look a lot better if I did an Ironman or a triathlon, as you often do. You're saying there's no more money and that UK Secretaries of State have said that. I disagree with that. There's been a lot of money for coronavirus. There's been a lot of money in the budget settlement. I suppose your point in regard to unionism at any cost, unionism obviously is expensive. Northern Ireland is the most subsidised part of the United Kingdom. A lot of British taxpayers on the British mainland are not too happy when they find out how much Northern Ireland is subsidised to the extent. But I suppose my point in regard to that would be that were there to be United Ireland, there would need to be at least some form of subsidy, and it has to come from somewhere, whether that would be what remained of the UK, the European Union, Ireland, America, who knows. So the economics for me would need to be looked into at a much greater level. Manley's point on Northern Ireland as a colony of the EU, I actually think the Northern Ireland, very unpopular view, is doing really well out of the protocol, because I think a lot of larger businesses, it's hammering smaller businesses, there's absolutely no doubt about that, and will continue to when those grace periods are gone. But a lot of larger businesses, especially from the GB to Northern Ireland direction, are actually doing quite well out of this, because they can cope with the paperwork, they've got the capacity, and they are making more money out of it, and that's the sort of the untold story of the protocol, essentially. But I don't think Manley and I are ever going to agree on that point. Brian asked what unionisms can do to make nationalists more comfortable. As much as possible would be my answer. How can you convince them that Northern Ireland could be as much of a home for them? I would argue actually before about 2015, I would say there was a sort of not quite a golden period, because things were still tricky and there were still problems with paramilitarism and various other things. But really between about 2010 and 2015 or so, I think about obviously the Queen's visit to Ireland, for example, there was very much a high point of relations between not just the UK and Ireland, but certainly I would argue, and how can I know this because I'm not a nationalist, but there seemed to be a time when people really weren't thinking first and foremost about national identity, and that was a very good time for Northern Ireland, and of course Brexit then changed that. Simon asked, does Britain have an interest either way? Of course, dating back to 1991, it was John Major who said that the UK government had no selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland, and it was up to the people in Northern Ireland. The principle of consent is there, but also I would argue since the end of the Troubles, thank goodness, but nonetheless, one of the effects of that has been what I, in my book, The Secret Life of Special Advisors, feel free to buy it and read it, is something called Blevins Law. So David Blevins is the senior Ireland correspondent for Sky News, and he says, never underestimate how little English people know, most English people know about Northern Ireland. And he has had many occasions when the Sky news desk in London has rung him to ask him questions such as, is Dublin in the same time zone as London, for example? And the very highly paid correspondent who referred to Gerry Adams and Mark McGuinness as Sinn Féin's big guns, which he then had to ring them and say, probably not the best way to describe them. Elaine mentioned the exposure to the GAA through the Telegraph. I should say that was GAA specifically. I've had lots of exposure to many nationalist traditions and so on, not only part of cross-community things I was very happily involved with at school, including a choir which was called People in Harmony, and I went to school at Portadown College, which was in a pretty near the Kilkenny estate in Portadown, a very loyalist area, and we sang at the church, the Catholic church on the Goverhy Road, with Clannad and with James Galway, believe it or not, which was lovely.
Peter, that's brilliant, mate. But I'm gonna have to come in because the clock's gonna be, and this is what I want to do. I want you and Colin to be thinking about what your last sort of 2 minutes of your best arguments or what you want to leave us with is. And as I take these questions from the audience, try your best to weave them in, but unfortunately, because of time, we don't have that long. So Alana, sorry to keep you waiting so long. And to the people who are about to ask questions or think out loud, do you mind if I ask if you're as concise as possible so we can fit everybody in? And sorry, guys, we're not going to get there's an awful lot of hands have appeared now. So I think we're going to get Alana, Roisin, Pauline, and David Irvin, who had their hands up. And then I'll take Ella last, who I think wants to come in with some points that people might have been raising in the chat box. And then it'll be the roundup. So Alana, apologies for making you wait so long.
No problem. I'd just like to say thank you for putting the show on tonight. It was really, really good. And I'd like to see a lot more of them as much as possible. I was born in the north in 71 during the Troubles. I live in London. I have various ideas that I would like to put forward as what a united Ireland could be looking like, but I'll leave that to another conversation with you in the future. But one of the questions that I think unionists need to be talking about, we all need to be talking about, is like, if we're really serious about a united Ireland, we need to be teaching in our schools at primary school level all about what socialism is, what republicanism is, what racism is. All those things are going to have to be taught now in school, because there's a lot of problems and we're not going to get further away from all the troubles if we're not teaching our kids what racism is, what socialism is. And I think that needs to be brought up. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. And Roisin, we're on to yourself. Welcome, Roisin.
Very good. Thanks, Colin and Peter, for a very interesting conversation tonight. The question I have is probably more likely for Colin. So I'm just wondering, to what extent can we rely on Brandon Lewis to call a border poll? I know, Colin, you've had correspondence with him, and he seems to kind of disregard the growing demand for Irish unity, and also he just, I'm open to being corrected, but I don't think he's kind of gave any statement or anything on the growing demand for unity and the growing conversation. So what can United Irelanders do to make sure that he is impartial when it comes to the border poll? Thanks very much.
Roisin. And I've just had a wee message from Ella, who's the boss, really. And she said, Kevin, those two people who had their hands up, who you weren't going to take them and run over slightly. I think one of them was Siobhan, and the other fella has disappeared. I think his name was Alex Cameron. So if he's still desperate to ask us a question, he can come in. So brilliant. Pauline, on to yourself.
Yeah, I'll be quick and concise. Just to say that I think when we talk about the involvement of British citizens in this discussion, it tends to reflect two things. One, the way that the British government has always governed in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, by keeping it at arm's length from the mainland. And that's been a deliberate and conscious strategy, not to let the sort of conflict and the politics of Northern Ireland impinge on the stability of British politics. And I think that means that people just, it's not that people don't care, it's that there are decades now of people actually not knowing. And the second thing really is, I think it leads to this idea of there being a sort of transactional relationship. So when we talk about money, we don't actually talk about a common economic or social framework like the National Health Service, universal healthcare. We talk about it in the most transactional terms. So I'm just saying, can we actually bring British citizens into this conversation? I think there's lots of things we can add as Democrats. And I think you'll be surprised to find that many people actually do support an orderly and amicable settlement in Northern Ireland, as opposed to the kind of fractious and unstable arrangements that exist at the moment.
Thank you very much, Pauline.
My question is for Peter. Firstly, do you think it's going to be harder to sell unionism to the nationalists when the United Kingdom today is more fractured, when Scotland is looking to gain independence and there's more talk now with Wales looking to break away and look to their own futures?
Thanks very much, David. And I think next we have, as he looks at his I think we've got Dennis Russell next.
I think there's something of an elephant in the room in the discussion. For me, the Good Friday Agreement was sort of clearly about one thing and one thing only. It was about a ratification of the process by which the Republican movement was brought to defeat. To pretend that it was anything else is disingenuous. Both the Southern Irish state, the British government, and indeed the Republican movement itself, the big guns of it, came together with something that could sort of provide a basis for ending the conflict after the years of the British Army through the SAS and all the various forces that it had, bringing the Republican movement to its knees. That's all it was about. It wasn't about much more than that. And those who think that you can have a united Ireland on the basis of some kind of economic parity, or that you can have a united Ireland where sort of unionism's basic core principle that we are British can coexist with something else, I think are kind of deluded. Now, 2008 showed what the Irish kind of economy, what happens to it when things go wrong internationally. It falls apart, yeah? And, the recent controversies around COVID-19 and vaccines and the protocol in Europe and the European Union showed what Ireland's relationship to the European Union is. Ireland is, as someone pointed out, something of a vassal state in relation to the European Union. Now, you think you can construct a united Ireland out of these kind of sort of situations that exist? It won't happen. A nation is born out of people believing in a shared history and in a shared sense in which the direction they want to go. And fine, economics may come into it, but I don't think it's in any sense the most important aspect to it. The idea that you can share in a democracy and citizenship with a shared history. And clearly, unionism is never going to share the history of the island of Ireland in anything other than a no surrender position.
Thank you, Dennis. There's nothing wrong with people getting stuck in, even if you disagree with them. So thank you very much for that. And I think we're on to Siobhan O'Dwyer. Siobhan, are you there?
Hi, I'm here all the way from Dublin. I suppose to pick up a little bit on what Peter was talking about in relation to the situation with the DUP at the moment, and for Colin also maybe to answer around this, because I suppose the thing I see at the moment, despite all our nice chats in a way about a border poll, etc., there is a huge danger that unionism and loyalism are now reverting to their old ways of never, 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 no surrender and no. And so that will shut down the debate. That is one of the ways of shutting down the debate that I think will play very much into the DUP's hands. I don't think the Ulster Unionists are strong enough to do very much about that. And so it really worries me that again leads us to another major compromise like the Good Friday Agreement was, as Dennis and others have said, that we end up with another compromise situation. It's too dangerous to talk about a united Ireland for the next 10 years, and all the work that Colin and others are doing around what a united Ireland might actually look like will basically be sold down the river again, and that it will lead to more conversations about, having 50 unionists in the Dáil and having a federation. And all of those things would be anti-democratic. They would be against what a united Ireland, sort of united Ireland that people like me want anyway. And so there's a real danger that this, while it's great in some ways as somebody who wants a united Ireland, that there is a conversation and a debate, I already see it going in the direction of a stalemate, a compromise. And there's absolutely no doubt that the Southern Irish state would happily accept another compromise, and kicking it down the road again for another 40 years. They would be delighted to do that. So I think there's going to be a huge battle around how would Peter assess what is going to happen over the next year or two? Maybe that's a bit mean, but also Colin as well, and those of us who want a united Ireland, we're going to be intimidated, or are we going to be intimidated off the pitch once again because of what's going to happen in Northern Ireland?
I'm sorry, Siobhan.
Yeah, sorry. I always talk too much when I get going.
I'm sorry.
Nice to see everyone.
Thanks, Siobhan. That was great. It's just the clock is pretty much beating us here. So if we can make the last person is Alex before I go to Ella, who might be telling us some questions from the chat box. If we can have Alex, and if you don't mind, Alex, nice and concise would be brilliant. How you doing, Alex?
All the better for seeing you, Kevin. Brilliant night, well done. An observation, I guess, and I'll make it as quick as a Glaswegian drinking a bottle of whiskey. It seems to me, especially listening to Colin, that it seems the discussion is just like listening to what's happening in Scotland. Historically, and I'm only talking in our lifetime, this was never the case. You could very easily say, here's the distinction between what's going on in Scotland and what's going on in Northern Ireland. I'm not so sure this is the case anymore. I think the Irish question has lost its progressive, has lost its, its national focus. And I mean that politically speaking. I just hear a technocratic series of conversations for Colin Harvey. I don't hear politics. And especially and most importantly, what I think is missing for questions of real democracy is missing in his contribution, which is people. Where are they figuring in this matter?
Thank you, Alex. Ella, it's over to you before we go back to the speakers. Colin's getting a bit of a hard time. Look forward to him coming back on that. But Ella, did you want to bring anything in from the chat box or anything broadly, Ella?
Yeah, just very quickly. There's been lots of questions in the chat, but it's very specific things in relation to either the Good Friday Agreement or the understanding of relationship between consent and compliance. But just to hone in on, the speakers don't have time for that. To hone in on one of them, someone early on asked a question about how this discussion is taking place at kitchen tables and whether it is taking place in people's sitting rooms and on buses, and is this a living, breathing thing that people are talking about? Not what evidence, but how do the speakers think people are discussing this? Ordinary people at home who aren't, as Alex might have said, technocrats, or aren't politicians or aren't commentators, but how is this being talked about at home? And it sort of relates to what I want to ask, which is the word abstract was used early on, and there's been a lot of discussion in the chat about why someone might be Republican or want a united Ireland because, as someone wrote in the chat, because the DUP has supposedly backward views when it comes to abortion or whatever, and as opposed to Republican parties or unification parties. I mean, I'd question that because of the history of Sinn Féin and abortion. But there's that argument that, you would be kind of instrumental in voting for a united Ireland because of the nature of sort of specific politics of the DUP. And then on the other side, I mean, Colin mentioned that he wasn't said this really strong point where he said, I'm not a nationalist, I'm an internationalist, and related that to European Union. Again, my question is, is it abstract to talk about unification as a process of independence, as a getting back to kind of basics, or is it not abstract but actually the question at hand? And does the complication of whether or not this is relating to Ireland's relationship to the European Union, or whether it's because you don't like the DUP's policy on abortion or gay marriage or whatever it is, isn't that kind of clouding the central question as to what these two sides are both really about? And that's not to say you have to go back through history, but to, are we afraid of being abstract and actually kind of clouding what the real direct nub of this question is, which for me anyway is about independence? But that's an incredibly complicated question to leave you with.
Thank you, Ella. And my God, when you go out to audiences, you never know what's going to happen. And who would have thought that Colin would have been getting probably a harder time than Peter even? That said, the questions came from left, right, and centre. How you're going to deal with them, I do not know. But I think, Peter, are you happy to come in and pick up what you want and to leave us with your final thoughts? Of course, we're only scratching the surface on the whole question of border poll and Irish Union debate. We'll have lots more time in the coming months and years to go further. But penny for your final thoughts, Peter.
Lovely, thanks very much. Alana, should we teach children what racism is? Yes, absolutely. It's horrendous and dreadful. Should we teach them what socialism is? Yes, we should. I was taught what socialism was, and I know it's a terrible system that can never work. Roisin talked about a growing demand for Irish unity and what should Brandon Lewis do when clearly more people want a referendum. Read the Belfast Agreement. It's very clear that there has to be a groundswell of opinion. There has to be evidence to show that a majority of people want a united Ireland before that is the case, and that is not the case at the moment. So go and have a look at that, I would say, Roisin, but totally can see where you're coming from, but it's just the situation that he's under, the constraints that the Belfast Agreement puts him under are worth having a look at. Pauline said the politics in Northern Ireland often is worked so that it doesn't impinge on Britain. I think Theresa May would probably disagree with you on that. Mary said, what about the rights of Irish people as well as those groups in the north who want to unite Ireland, or a new Ireland, sorry? I would say that the principle of consent is specifically in regard to people in Northern Ireland. So I can totally see where you're coming from, but that you got to look at what the agreement says. Dennis Russell, I completely disagree with every single word you said, but thank you for your contribution. Siobhan O'Dwyer, what's going to happen over the next year? I think we're going to have an assembly election that is disastrous for unionism. I think you could possibly see Naomi Long as Deputy First Minister. I think you could, I think the leadership of the DUP could well end up under Edwin Poots. But all of that could be wrong. I don't know. David Irvine, is it harder to sell unionism now with the Scotland argument and noises from Wales? Yes. Ella, kitchen tables and sitting rooms. The conversation is living and breathing, not probably to the extent that it is for people on this call, of course, but we're all interested in politics and all the rest of it, but it is there. The abstract idea, I completely agree with you on that point, whoever made that point. In terms of the aspect of the abstract aspect, I mean, the point I always raised was why were you for academic selection because you were a unionist, and why were you against academic selection because you were a nationalist? It's got nothing to do with either of those things. And I mean, I dislike basically every social moral policy of the DUP, but it hasn't clouded my judgment on the union. Irvine rather than Irvine, I do apologise, David. Sean Napier asked, could I ask Peter as a final thought, does unionism believe in engaging in constitutional dialogue equate to an acceptance of defeat before the debate has even started? To which I would answer no, because I've just spent the last 2 hours doing it. And thank you very much indeed to everybody who's made this evening happen. All I would say is that tonight's conversation, both with Colin and with everybody else and with every comment that has come in, I think is an example for how this debate should occur in a really constructive and safe environment, and a very respectful one as well. I felt really, really welcome here, totally vindicated in my decision to take part, and thank you very much indeed for everyone, and apologies to Brenda. Maybe we can go to an Armagh match at some stage at Croke Park when they no doubt will win the Salmon Bar.
Peter, thanks very much for being so gracious there as well, and for the speed with which you rammed through those responses. That was great. Colin, on to yourself, last but not least.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. And I'd also just like to echo the thoughts of Peter there in relation to the discussion tonight. It's been really, really very welcome. I'm also going to make a suggestion. Look, I can't do justice to all the detailed questions in the chat box and the questions that have been asked. I very much want to do justice to all those questions, and I very much appreciate people asking. So what I'd like to do is not think about tonight as a one-off event. My contact details are on the Queen's website, and people can follow up with me after tonight. So I don't want the conversation to end this evening. I want to continue. So what I'll try and do now, in the interest of us all getting home at some point and getting off the computers, is to try and summarize a number of the key themes emerging from all the questions that we've heard. But the premise is really I want us to continue the conversation tonight, and there's some remarkable points being made and challenging points being made as well. Let me start and be absolutely clear. I may sound technocratic, maybe an academic, but people are at the front and center of this conversation. The right to self-determination and the Good Friday Agreement belongs to the people of this island. It's the people of this island that are going to benefit from the new constitutional arrangements. And that is why also in preparing for the propositions that emerge, organizations like Ireland's Future have put an all-island citizens' assembly at the heart of the discussion, because this shouldn't be an elite top-down process of people being told what the options are. This should be a bottom-up process designed by people, by citizens engaging. I think what we need to do now, and people ask, what could we do now, is we need to get ready. We need to get on with doing the work. Yes, I've been writing letters to Brandon Lewis. Anybody who follows my Twitter account will see I publish those letters online. I make everybody aware of what they are. But we shouldn't be waiting for Brandon Lewis. We should be getting on with doing the preparatory work now. My view on that is, to be candid, is that the British government will not ultimately move until Dublin moves as well. And I think it's when an Irish government is saying that now is the right time, I think a British government in particular will move on this issue. So yes, Brandon Lewis and spelling out the evidence he uses is important, but we need to get ready. Alana raised a question about the sort of Ireland we want to see. Let me be clear tonight. When I talk about a new Ireland, I mean a new Ireland. I'm not using it as hot air or rhetoric. And so the big question for me is, what is the new component of that? I've spent my entire life working for social justice, for economic justice, for human rights and equality. Those values need to be absolutely at the heart of the conversation about a new Ireland. It needs to be a new Ireland. It can't just be a tweak north and south. It can't just be a perpetuation of the status quo that has failed people north and south for the last 100 years. It needs to be different, and it needs to be challenging. In relation to some of the questions that have come in, this is going to be a managed transition over time, in my view. And in terms of the discussions around this, including the economic discussions around it, we need to be clear. This is going to be a process. It's not going to be a one-off event. It's going to be responsibly managed. It's going to be supported internationally. And I think often underestimated in this conversation is the sort of international support a reunified Ireland will enjoy all over the world. And that includes tangible support from the US and the EU, among others. There was reference to this debate being shut down, derailed. Look, let me be clear. This debate will continue. This debate is gaining momentum, if anything. In terms of people being involved, look, everybody in this conversation knows you can hardly turn the TV on, turn the radio on, look at a newspaper without there being a contribution on the debate about constitutional change on these islands, on this island, across these islands. So, the traction is there, it's moving. I'm absolutely convinced we are now heading towards referendums on this island, and we have a responsibility to get ready, to do the sort of hard work. And I'm very, very conscious in terms of the question that was raised around sounding technocratic, even sounding quite boring in relation to some of this. But part of that is because, you know, the hard work needs to be done, and some of it will be tedious, but there'll also be the emotional case as well. There'll be the emotional case around, you know, we'll be much better off together on this island, unleashing the potential. You know, we're being held back. We've been avoiding each other for 100 years. We need to stop doing that. And just to end, in terms of a message that I would like to end on, I want to thank the organizers for organizing what I think has been a remarkably helpful contribution to the discussion. I want to really thank Peter for engaging with me. It's for another evening, I think, where I'll share some of my experiences over the last number of years, where people, rather than engaging with me, have preferred to write to my employers about me. So I would really like to thank Peter for his openness and willingness tonight to talk to me about these issues. And just to end,
Colin, before you do, sorry, the next time we're in Belfast, I'll buy you a pint.
Okay. I don't drink, Peter, so it's fine.
Neither do I, so it'll be bad cook for me.
You can both buy me a pint then.
Absolutely. But I suppose that just to, you know, finish and end, you know, Kevin and Peter, look, I used the analogy of the process of designing a home, designing a shared home for everyone on this island. And, you know, it's important that as many people as possible participate in that design process. I utterly understand that other people will be designing an alternative home. But in terms of the home that I'm designing and that the architects of that home are working on, they want it to be a warm and welcoming place for everyone. So I really end this evening by inviting everyone in this conversation to extend a warm and welcoming invitation to join us all in designing a shared home place for everyone on this island, and that we'll be all better off at the end of it. So thank you all very much.
Colin, thank you so much. Colin, brilliant summing up, incidentally. Peter and Colin, I can't thank you enough. And to all our audience, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. And please sign up to the mailing list of irishborderpool.com. This is just the beginning of what we're going to be doing. And of course, the broader, huge discussion right across Ireland and elsewhere. But other than that, guys, time to go. Get a bit of dinner, a cup of tea or a glass of wine or whatever you're doing after this. Thanks a million for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed the speakers and the contributions. I absolutely hugely did. I got a huge amount of notes written down and food for thought. So to all of the audience, thank you very much for listening in, and to Colin and Peter, I'm glad to hear that this is just the beginning of a great relationship. So Guramagat, and thank you very much. Thanks a million, guys, and good night.